Hello, hello. We are live. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I think we're starting out with a good amount of gems with us tonight, which we're so grateful for, because today I think that we even need to start with a trigger warning, even though I think that the headline says it all. We're going to talk about a crime that is difficult to talk about. In fact, many people have been writing us. This is a crime that happened on June 15th. People, gems, all of you have been writing us for weeks asking if we're going to cover this, and we just kept John and I saw the emails coming through, and we felt that maybe we should cover it, but it was a hard case. And I actually said to John, I'm kind of avoiding the case. I know what it's about, and I just don't know, like, if I want to go learn about it. It might be too heavy. Boundaries, right? We all have to have our boundaries in true crime. And, I learned all about, I saw their faces. I learned about Clayton and Hunter and Chase, and it was a lot. So John and I kept thinking about it, though, and we had plans to cover Kohberger tonight, as many of you know. But the emails just kept coming, and it was this email from you. And all of your emails we see them, we hear them. They all mean a lot to us. We knew that there was a big request for us to cover this case of Chad Doerman, but it was this email that John and I saw, that we decided, okay, you know what, we do need to cover this for our community. So before we begin, I want everyone to know that the domestic violence hotline is in the description of this video. And if we have any moderators listening, if you can share it there too. We're going to also have fewer moderators with us tonight, because our moderators, some of them don't want to delve into this case. One of our moderators just kind of avoids crimes with children. We understand. So I want to start with that sort of trigger warning introduction to this. We're going to, of course, like John and I always do, cover this very carefully, with heart, with love, with care, with hope that we can maybe help. And let me read you this email we received from a hidden gem. I can't remember, when was this email sent, John? It was definitely
last week.
Was it last week?
Yeah.
It definitely changed our thoughts. So Jessica writes, will you be covering Chad Doerman? It is such a sad story, and I saw it and I can't unsee it. I feel like I need therapy, and I've been traumatized by it, and I need someone to help me make sense of the tragedy so I can go about my days without crying. I hope you might cover it, Jessica. And Jessica, thank you. And thank you to everyone who wrote us and requested that we cover us, because that is why we're covering it.
Right. It seems like this case is having that impact on a lot of people. And I noticed, actually, when I was waiting to go on, that there were a few people in chat that said, I can't do this. I'm jumping off because this is too much. And one person said that she was in Ohio and not too far from where the crime occurred, and she said, I can't do it. I'm getting off. So we respect that and appreciate that, and we're glad that people recognize what they can't take and their boundaries. And so, but here we are. We're gonna dive into this case. It's a tough one. I think there has been some collective trauma around this case. I know it's somewhat traumatic to me as well, but based on the information we have, which is not a huge amount, but I think we have sufficient information to develop some opinions, and they're going to be speculative, but just based on my experience and knowledge, this is kind of where I'm at. I reserve the right to amend my opinion as more information comes out, but I think this is my take on the case at the moment, and I feel like it has a fairly solid basis in some evidence that we know. So that's where we're going to go tonight.
Yes. And I want to also share Brooklyn's comment. It's really important to talk about this. Laura is not the only woman in this kind of relationship, and hopefully this can help someone. And that is, yes, what Hidden is about. Thank you, Stephanie May, for also being here. And thank you to all of our moderators that are here. Our moderators collectively understand that some of our mods aren't here tonight. Some of them are, and we thank those that can't be here. So thank you. Yes. And where do you want to start, Dr. John? Dr. John, I told John, I go, this is your show, because I think I'm with all of our gems here tonight, all of our viewers here tonight, wanting you to help us make sense of this, because this is very hard for me.
So I'm gonna start in a place that may seem a little unusual, but I'm actually gonna read a quote from Dostoevsky. This is from the Brothers Karamazov, and the reason I'm going to read this quote is because there's a big portion of this book that deals with children and crimes against children and why that is so traumatizing. So I think I want to start with a quote that might kind of get us into this issue of how this has impacted people so much and maybe why. And so I'm going to start with, this is from the Brothers Karamazov. It's the Constance Garnett translation, which is one of the first major translations in English. This is from the Rebellion section, which is right before the Grand Inquisitor, for those who know the Brothers Karamazov. So this is a lead up to the Grand Inquisitor, which is one of the more famous chapters in all of Western literature. But this is setting the stage for that chapter. Dostoevsky is talking, Ivan Karamazov is talking. He's referring to a little girl of 5. He says, there was a little girl, this is on page 222. Quote, there was a little girl of 5 who was hated by her father and mother. It is a peculiar characteristic of many people, this love of torturing children, and children only. To all other types of humanity, these torturers behave mildly and benevolently, but they are very fond of tormenting children. It's just their defenselessness that tempts the tormentor, just the angelic confidence of the child who has no refuge and no appeal that sets their vile blood on fire. Let me read that last part again. He's talking about children and why we're so affected by crimes against children. So Dostoevsky says, Ivan, specifically Karamazov, says, it's just their, meaning children, it's just their defenselessness that tempts the tormentor, just the angelic confidence of the child who has no refuge and no appeal.
Yeah.
So, that quote has always hit home for me in the sense that he's really pointing out why we're so incensed by crimes against children. That children are defenseless, they're angelic in some ways. He calls it angelic confidence. I love that. They're innocent. They have no harmful motives. There's no malice. All children want is, he says here, refuge. They want shelter. They want to be protected. And they have no appeal, meaning they're completely dependent upon parents for their well-being and for their survival. And so I think in many ways, harming children is a violation of, it's a fundamental violation of the social contract and certainly our parental obligations. I think that's why people are so outraged and traumatized when we see these types of crimes against children. And this one in particular is so egregious and so extreme in the sense that he essentially murdered his kid's execution style that, it's unfathomable. So I think the Dostoevsky quote helps, I think, maybe in understanding some of our outrage when we think about this crime.
Thank you. Thank you. Faye is saying, yeah, they are just pure love. Taylor, they just want love and acceptance. Brittany, the closest things we have to God himself. Right. The defenseless. Thank you, Janine. Yeah, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase. 7, 5, and 4, I believe. You froze for a bit there, but you're back.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say. So let's start with that. I think that provides some explanation of some of the outrage here. But if we're going to understand this crime, there's really a key question I keep coming back to in trying to understand this crime. And it's what we're going to try to answer tonight, because I think it's the key to unlocking this crime and understanding, in this case, Chad Doerman. And that question is, why did he not kill his wife? So
That's
we know
it.
that he...
My first thought was I just want to say family annihilation, right? But he didn't want to hurt his wife. Usually that's what we hear. Go ahead, babe. Sorry.
Right. And so technically, when you look at this crime, it might be classified as a filicide, which is to say that only children are murdered. So filicide is the elimination of children, or the murder of children specifically. We tend to think of most filicides as some we've talked about a lot, but we tend to think of filicides as occurring most frequently with mothers, and oftentimes postpartum depression. And so when you look at this case, it appears as if this is a filicide on the surface.
Yeah.
And I think
right.
if you dig a little deeper, there's some real lingering questions about this, and this would be a filicide. I think you can classify it as a filicide because the children were murdered. But I think if you dig a little deeper, it becomes apparent that this is really a case of domestic violence, or I guess the more common term these days is interpersonal violence, or IPV. So I think we need to really understand why this is a domestic violence case and what that entails and how that leads to the murder of these children.
Thank you. And by the way, I just want to share that the full Chad Doerman indictment is in the description of this video. We have links that we've put there for those that do want to understand more, because we're not going into all the details. Go ahead, babe.
So we know that Chad shot his wife, Laura. He shot Laura's hand in an attempt to take the child back from her so that he could harm the child. And certainly in that moment, he had every opportunity to kill her, to murder her as well. And he didn't, right? So I think that's a really pivotal moment in understanding this, because it's clear that he could have murdered her and he chose not to. And so the question here is why did he not kill her? Right. And I think we're going to have to back up a little bit to start answering that question. One of the problems here is that this is fairly recent. This case is fairly recent, and there's not a lot of information available. So we've dug as deeply as we can to obtain information we think is relevant to answering that question. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the information we need is going to come out in the future, so we don't have access to all of it. But let's look at what we do know. There was a domestic violence charge in 2010 where Chad was accused of trying to choke his father, Keith. We don't know. What's that?
I said, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So we don't know. I don't know the details of that. I'd love to see. Eventually, maybe we'll see the arrest report, or the report from that incident. That case was actually dismissed. So he was charged and he was not convicted, which is interesting for me, because from a risk standpoint, when somebody is not convicted, it doesn't necessarily count against their future risk of violence. So he wasn't convicted, but let's think about this for a moment. Let's think about the implications of this choking. Choking is a very serious offense. So when I hear that someone's trying to choke someone, it actually doesn't take a lot to kill someone from strangulation, from choking them. So you have to wonder here if this is something more than choking. Is this attempted murder? Is this what led to this? Was there an altercation between Chad and his father, Keith? I don't know. There's a lot of questions here. But what we do know is that it was sufficient that somebody in the family called it in. I don't know if it was Keith. Somebody called this in. Chad was charged with it. He was 19 years old. This is 2010.
Wow, he was young.
And so what we can learn from this moment is, number one, Chad is quite capable of violence, and actually quite severe violence. That choking is not he's not pushing his dad, he's choking him. he's
Right.
he's
Personal.
doing something. So when you think about choking for a minute, the reality is that if you want to choke someone and you want to harm them severely or even kill them, you only need slightly more pressure than opening a Coke can or a soda can. It doesn't take a lot. People don't realize, I think, how easy it is to murder someone through strangulation. So this is a very serious offense, but it gets dismissed because Keith, the father, does not show up at court. So essentially, Keith may have called it in, I don't know, and then he walked away from it, and the charge gets dismissed because there's nobody to really pursue those allegations or to make an argument that there was a crime, right? So there's a couple of things we learned from that. Number one, at 19 years old, Chad is quite violent. He's engaging in violent behavior, even though he's not convicted. And number two, I think it indicates dysfunction in this family. I think it indicates that there's quite possibly some history of violence and abuse in the Doerman family growing up. And I'm coming to that conclusion because obviously when you try to choke your father, things are not going exceedingly well. And so you have to assume, so there might be a presumption here, and I could be wrong about this, that there could be a juvenile record that's sealed. And so that wouldn't be, if people were doing FOIA requests for criminal history, for example, they're not going to get the juvenile record if it's sealed. So it's interesting that there's another criminal charge for criminal damaging in 2009. So this is right before the choking incident. Chad was 18 years old at the time. Criminal damaging in Ohio means essentially destroying property, but it can also mean arson. There's many ways you can destroy property, and one of them, which is part of criminal damaging in Ohio, is arson. And so you have to wonder what happened there. And again, we don't have access to that report, that police report, but I would love to see it, because what property was damaged, how was it damaged, those are really interesting questions here. But from my perspective, what's really telling about this situation is that you have two charges immediately when Chad becomes an adult. The first charge is 18 years old. The second charge is 19. 18 tends to be the age at which adolescents are charged as adults. Sometimes the court system will keep 18-year-olds in the juvenile system. Sometimes they won't. It really depends. But so that really, it's a bit of a red flag to me in terms of suggesting that perhaps there's a juvenile record that was later sealed and that we're not having access to at the moment, because it's much more difficult to get that information for a minor. So presumably there could be some other charges that we don't know about. But even if there aren't, I think these charges are interesting in and of themselves, particularly the choking charge. It's a very violent behavior. It's suggestive of future risk of violence. And I think it's also indicative of possible abuse in this family. I wouldn't be surprised to see some type of domestic violence between Chad's parents when he was growing up. I wouldn't be surprised to see some type of physical violence. But I think it's a fair assumption to say that when you start choking your dad, your relationship is not going well. So let's start with that. So there's another component to that, by the way, that I want to
please, and I want to let people know that I also added those dismissed domestic violence charges you mentioned about Chad. They are also in the description of this video. Thank you.
Okay.
Multitasking. So those are also now added.
So there's let's look at the other side of that coin, because there's something else interesting here, which is that Keith Doerman, the father who was choked in 2010, made a statement to one of the news stations in Cincinnati about this incident. And what Keith said a couple of things. One is he attributed Chad's behavior to snapping. He said, my son snapped, essentially. So that was his explanation, which he didn't snap. First of all, let's just say that. But that would be more evidence to me of possible violence in this family, because the father is being completely dismissive of any violence. The father has to know that there's problems in this marriage. The father has to know that his son is quite aggressive with his children. There's no way his father hasn't seen that or heard about that, especially probably from Laura, his wife. But anyway, so the father dismisses it. That, clearly this is a situation where Keith is, I think, in some denial about maybe a past history of violence in the family, maybe some history of domestic violence that he's not willing to face. So to attribute this crime to his son snapping is a complete dismissal of what happened. Also, later his father said, after Chad appeared in court, Keith Doerman said, quote, "I could tell in his eyes he was hollow inside. That wasn't Chad standing in the arraignment. That was not him." And so again, we get this denial about who his son is, and that I think you have a father here who probably has some guilt about having raised a child potentially in a traumatic or violent environment, and he's now trying to avoid dealing with the repercussions of that, right? So
absolutely.
This is the way Keith Doerman is distancing himself from this crime and trying to absolve himself of any responsibility. So again, I'm basing this on not a huge amount of information. I don't have any proof that these things happened. I don't have any proof that there was violence in the family. I'm making a lot of inferences, but this is what we know at the moment. So let's start with that. So the choking, the potential violence in the family, I think, his father's denial, I think all these are important. Then I would move on to some of the quotes. So I have some of the statements from neighbors. I think these are really fascinating. Neighbors, probably more than anyone, would know this family, and they've observed this family. There's a statement by a male neighbor. It's actually on video.
Mm-hmm.
He's not identified in the video, but one of the local stations talked to him. So I can't give you his name because he's not listed. I presume that he asked the station not to put his name up, but there is another neighbor that is identified. I'll talk about his statement in a minute, but let's deal with this statement from one of the neighbors. So this statement is, quote, he's talking about Chad here. "The guy was unstable and very mean. He was very angry, every day yelling at his wife, dogging her and downgrading the kids, just very angry. And if they didn't do what he said," and then the quote ends, he gets cut off. But wow, right? So let's look at his statement a little more closely. I mean, we know Chad's angry, but he's just reiterating that. The most interesting part of that statement is that he says that he saw him yelling at his wife every day, quote, dogging her and downgrading her. So right there, he's telling us, if we know nothing else and we trust this neighbor to be truthful and accurate, he's telling us that that's domestic violence. Dogging and downgrading someone is abuse. That's emotional abuse. And now if he's doing that in public, by the way, if he's doing that for a neighbor to see, look out for what's happening behind closed doors, because I promise you this guy's going to be way more aggressive behind closed doors. If he's not concerned about his public persona, then he's certainly not going to be concerned about his private persona. So the unidentified neighbor, and I watched the video that this is on camera, so this can be verified, is essentially telling us that this is a violent relationship. So this is a case of interpersonal violence, and apparently Chad has no qualms about showing this violent attitude in public. And then, of course, the neighbor says that he does the same thing. He downgrades the kids. He's angry all the time. And then he says if they didn't do what he said, presumably that we can finish that sentence with, if he didn't do what he said, he became more angry or more aggressive, right? He didn't finish that sentence, but that would indicate a need for control quite clearly. So the neighbor is giving us more clues. We have the choking incident. We have the neighbor now saying that he's belittling his wife, Laura, essentially. Let's turn to another statement by a neighbor. This neighbor was identified. His name is Richard Kincannon. Here's what Richard Kincannon said about Chad. He said, quote, "He tossed a couple of them," meaning the kids. "He tossed a couple of the kids around the yard one day, tried to tell them to go in the house, and picked them up and threw them. He was angry every day. There wasn't a day he didn't yell at his wife and his kids out there meaning the yard." So again, Chad he's just putting his anger on public display. He is apparently picking up his kids and throwing them when he perceives that they're out of control, right? This is child abuse of sorts. Clearly the neighbor didn't feel like it was sufficient to call in, or didn't warrant a call to CPS, but this is more evidence of his anger, his aggression, and his violence. So let's turn to, this is a female neighbor. She made a statement also on camera. She didn't identify herself. I think she wanted to be anonymous. The female neighbor claims that she called the police on Chad. She called the police on Chad because he threatened to kill her dog. And she claimed that he was drinking. She could tell that he was drunk quite a bit, that he drank alcohol daily, according to her. I don't know how closely she was keeping an eye on Chad, but there are other accounts that he had some problems with alcohol, by the way. So, but the neighbor identifies that quite explicitly here. And then she says that he was always yelling at the kids. So those are three statements that all corroborate each other. They all point to the same types of behaviors. They all provide evidence of someone who could be potentially violent. So I think those statements are important in understanding this case, because to me, they paint a picture of an aggressive husband who is more than likely, at a minimum, verbally aggressive towards his wife, probably physically aggressive towards his wife. We know he's physically aggressive towards the children. And so that's where I want to start.
Thank you. Yeah, and a lot of people are agreeing with you and pointing out things that the neighbors have said, and yeah. And if somebody, I want to point out, if a neighbor did call, Child Protective Services, I don't know if there's much they could have done anyway.
Yeah, right. Well, there's some they could have done. They could have, if they recognized that he had a substance abuse problem, they could have gotten him in for substance abuse treatment. If they recognized that he had an anger problem, they probably could have put him in some type of therapy for that. That's not to say that these issues seem to go very deep for Chad Doerman, so I'm not sure that would have had any impact. But I mean, getting him sober would have been a good start if they could have done that. I'm not sure they could have done that, but there is, by the way, there is a definite correlation. There's a lot of research showing that males in domestic violence relationship are more likely to engage in severe abuse if they're drinking or doing drugs. Yeah. So,
and I also want to, I think I need to clarify what I said. I wish they had called. They could have opened up an investigation, as people pointed out. I didn't want to dismiss. I want to make that clear. They should have called. That is what neighbors could have done. Sorry. Go ahead. An investigation could have been good.
So there is a relationship between alcohol and drugs and violence, specifically in interpersonal violence relationships, that we know that the violence is greater and more likely when people are drinking. And so presumably, according to one of the neighbors, he had a severe alcohol problem. We'll talk about this in a minute, but there's a rumor out there on the Facebook groups that Laura was going to leave him, that she had told him that if he didn't stop drinking, She was done with the relationship. She was going to seek a divorce. And supposedly, according to this rumor is based on someone who apparently knew Laura, but we can't confirm this at all. So this is pure speculation. Maybe more will come out about this, but according to the source here, which we haven't talked to the source, so again, this is just pure speculation, but Chad had threatened to harm the children if she left. That was supposedly the narrative. So
literally keeping her hostage. It's like a hostage situation. If you leave me, I will hurt the kids.
So let's talk about, so if we see this as a domestic violence or interpersonal violence situation, I think we can start making more sense of it. I'm going to reference a book that I've talked about before. It's called When Men Batter Women. It's by Neil Jacobson and John Gottman. For those mental health people that are watching this or tuning into this, you'll know John Gottman well because he ran the Love Lab at the University of Washington for many years, and he's done some really amazing research on relationships and what makes healthy relationships and what doesn't. But many people don't know that Gottman was also doing research on domestic violence in the Love Lab in the mid to late 90s. And Neil Jacobson, by the way, was somebody who I consulted with in the domestic violence area in the late 90s for some projects I was working on. And I actually, for a moment there, I was going to meet Neil Jacobson. He was coming to Las Vegas to conduct a seminar. And tragically and sadly, Neil passed away the night that he was supposed to be in Vegas. Well, he was in Vegas, and then he didn't show up for the workshop, and he had passed away. So I never had a chance to meet him. But I want to say this. I want to give a big shout out to Neil Jacobson, Professor Jacobson, I'll call him, because I did talk to him, and he was an amazing guy. And what could be a better tribute to Neil Jacobson than to cite his research? This book was published in 1998. What could be a better research than to cite a better tribute to Neil Jacobson than to cite his research 25 years later? This research is still relevant. It's still explanatory. It's still very, very excellent research. And so this research was completely unique at the time in the 90s. So Jacobson and Gottman, they had couples that had a history of violence, and they observed them in their Love Lab, and they hooked up. People that are familiar with the Love Lab will know that this is a place where couples actually resided for several days. They lived there. They observed interactions in this lab. They had electrodes hooked up to them so they could look at blood pressure and galvanic skin responses and all kinds of interesting things. So it's this research is actually quite interesting because it's very detailed. And one of the things that Jacobson and Gottman observed when they looked at fights between couples and they looked at how they interacted was they observed that when couples were in the midst of these fairly serious fights, that there was a group of men who actually showed responses during aggression that were unusual in the sense that their heart rates actually went down. They actually became calmer. And they thought this was really bizarre. This was something they did not expect. I'm going to read a little bit from the Jacobson and Gottman book. I'm going to let them explain it since they can explain it better than me. But they say, this is on page 28, we noticed that there was an enormous range in the heart rates of the men we were studying as they became aggressive during the arguments. We were astonished to find that in 20% of the batterers, there was a decrease in heart rate as they became more verbally aggressive. This discovery was counterintuitive. So I'm going to go on. We found that the men who lowered their heart rates during marital interaction were far more emotionally aggressive towards their wives at the very start of the interaction than other men. They began the conversation being immediately belligerent, defensive, or contemptuous. If you were to watch these men on videotape, you would think that they were so stirred up that you would probably pick them out as good candidates for a stroke or a heart attack. And yet, the physiological data we were collecting in the control room were telling us that they were calm, calmer than they had been when we had asked them to close their eyes and relax. And this is the critical part. Like the cobra, who becomes quite still and focused just before striking its victim at more than 100 miles an hour, these men were calming themselves internally and focusing their attention while striking swiftly at their wives with vicious verbal aggression. And so, because of this ability to lower their heart rates, Jacobson and Gottman labeled these types of men cobras. So they came up with two types of domestic violence batterers, and those were pit bulls and cobras. And so you might be wondering, why am I bringing this up? The reason this is relevant is because another piece of data we have is the body cam footage. And many people have observed in the body cam footage that when the police approach Chad Doerman, he's calm. He's eerily calm.
That's a question everyone has.
Yeah.
That body cam footage gets us all. He's calm.
He's calm. And so I think our gems can see where I'm going with this, but I've watched a lot of body cam footage of crimes and violent crimes, by the way, and in the vast majority of cases, the offenders are quite agitated. They're walking around. When police approach them, it's hard to get them under control because they're so agitated, and the police have to work to calm them. Not Chad Doerman. When they approach him, he's calm, he's composed. It's almost as if he's just waiting for them, right? And so this brings us back to the idea of the cobra. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Chad Doerman has some characteristics of a cobra in the sense that his physiological response to murdering his 3 kids is that he's calm and he becomes calm. I don't know if he was agitated when he was doing it, but it looks and feels a lot like this type of batterer to me that Jacobson and Gottman are describing, which by the way, not coincidentally, Robert Hare is spelled H-A-R-E, Robert Hare, who's done a huge amount of research on psychopaths, Robert Hare found something very similar among psychopaths. Robert Hare found that when psychopaths are engaged in conflict and violence, the same thing happens. Their heart rates go down. They're able to calm themselves. And so I'm not suggesting that I don't know if Chad Doerman has psychopathic characteristics, but it's interesting to note that cobras and psychopaths have this unusual ability during violent confrontations to reduce their heart rates and to calm themselves.
Wow.
I will read, let me just read quickly. This is again from the Jacobson and Gottman book. And this is a quote: "The Cobras showed evidence of severe antisocial, criminal-like traits, and they were also highly sadistic in their aggression." So there's that element too.
Wow. That answers, I think, one of my most major questions. That was, for me, I was like, how could he be so calm? What's his end goal? Why is he calm? Wow.
Yeah. So, so again, if I frame this in terms of a domestic violence relationship, then I think this idea of the cobra that Jacobson and Gottman talk about is a really important idea, because cobras are also indiscriminately violent. So the other type of domestic violence offender they call pit bulls. Pit bulls are generally insecure, and they're much less violent and aggressive than cobras, and they essentially they confine their violence to typically to spouses only. So pit bulls keep the violence within the family. Sometimes they can be violent towards children, but more likely they confine it to simply, to the partner or the spouse. And again, if we're looking at Chad Doerman in terms of domestic violence, this choking incident from 2010 now becomes even more relevant, in the sense that he's being violent outside of his family unit, his nuclear family, right? That his aggression extends beyond his spouse to his father, to apparently one of the neighbors whose dog he threatens to kill, to who knows else, to maybe a coworker. This is a quote from a friend, Mark Holland. Mark Holland was identifying himself. Mark Holland, and I don't know the nature of their friendship, but Mark Holland says, quote, "Chad had a bad temper, and I mean really bad. I think he was a bomb ready to explode." So people recognize this anger. And this violence that Chad exhibits seems to be broad. It seems to be indiscriminate. So pit bulls confine their violence to the spouse. Cobras don't. Cobras are they're more broadly violent. This is another quote from, I know I'm reading a lot from the Jacobson book, but I think it's very helpful. So you might ask, how do cobras get to that point? What is it that creates the cobra? And so this is a wonderful quote, I think, that really helps answer that question. If we go back to the idea that I just talked about, that there might have been violence in the Doerman family growing up based upon the choking incident, and perhaps Keith Doerman's minimization of any type of involvement or impact on this crime, then this would help explain that. So one of the characteristics of cobras, according to Jacobson and Gottman, this is page 94, is that cobras come from more chaotic homes and they have more traumatic childhoods. This is how they explain it. Quote, "In many ways, we were left with the impression that cobras had come from backgrounds that more seriously crushed something very fragile that every child begins life with, a kind of implicit trust that despite all their limitations, parents have the child's best interest at heart." So they're saying that in families in which cobras grow up, the trust is crushed. That the implicit trust that should exist between a parent and a child, and this gets back to the Dostoevsky quote, by the way, that trust is violated in a fundamental way. I'm going to continue on.
Please.
Quote, "Our image was that this horrible childhood background had somehow led the cobras to vow to themselves that no one would ever control them again." So this is where control comes in. I'm going to repeat that. So trust is violated, that there's a sense of helplessness, and Jacobson and Gottman are saying that our image was that this horrible childhood background had somehow led the cobras to vow to themselves that no one would ever control them again. And I think that's really fascinating, because certainly that seems to be the case here. Control, this idea that the neighbor said if they didn't do what he said, right, the implication being that if somebody didn't do what Chad Doerman said, they were in trouble. And then the last part of this quote, this is from Jacobson and Gottman, quote, "Somehow they had all managed to change their normal physiological reactions in the same way." That's fascinating to me, because they're saying, in essence, that there's this helplessness which leads to control. And in order to survive in those traumatic environments,
Mm-hmm.
that these children had to learn to calm themselves.
Oh, yeah.
These children had to learn to regulate their heart rates so that they were calm during the violence. And so that's essentially how you develop a cobra. There's one final quote I want to read from Gottman, and from the Gottman book, that's, I think, important in terms of understanding how the victims respond to them. And this is page 29 from the same book. Quote, "We found that the net effect of the cobra's peculiar way of marital attack had on the wives was to suppress their expression of anger, increase their level of fear, and produce significant amounts of sadness." So the way the cobras interact with their wives and spouses and partners, the goal is essentially to reduce anger. It's to negate any anger they might have so that they have total control of the relationship. It's to increase their level of fear. And Chad Doerman instilled a lot of fear in a lot of people. And it's to produce significant amounts of sadness, which means that many of the partners of cobras or people in these types of relationships probably suffer from some type of depression or sadness at the very least. And so I think that's fascinating that the goal here really is to unilaterally control the relationship, and to do so through fear and intimidation by suppressing any anger in the victim. So essentially the victim can't fight back. The victim becomes completely helpless and dormant, much in the way that a cobra felt helpless in their own childhoods with violence. Now they're doing that to their spouses. And so I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, that relationships with cobras are very, very difficult to leave, because the fear is extreme.
It makes sense. For those wondering, it's Why Men Batter Women. That's the book that...
Yeah. When Men Batter Women, Jacobson and Gottman. So that's one component of domestic violence relationships I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about other components as well. A lot of people don't know, and this is some research I was involved in many years ago. When I was on a domestic violence project, I did some work with Jeffrey Edelson, who is at the University of Minnesota. And Edelson was mainly interested in the impact of domestic violence on children, and specifically on how the child protective system handles domestic violence and whether they do it well. And one of the things that Edelson's research showed was that there's something that we now call dually aggressive fathers. So you have singly aggressive fathers, which means that they confine violence mainly to the spousal relationship. And then you have dually aggressive fathers, which those are fathers that are violent towards the spouse, partner, and the children. And this is where this becomes significant, that the studies that have examined this, and Edelson is one of several people that have looked at this. There's also a couple of researchers, Nichols and Slepp, that have done a lot of research looking at the co-occurrence of child maltreatment and interpersonal violence. And what they found, and I don't think people realize the extent of this, but what they found is that roughly 40 to 60%, or even more, sometimes upwards of 70%, of relationships that have domestic violence also have child abuse. So in other words, if you see someone like Chad Doerman who is in a violent relationship with his wife, then the probability of that person abusing their children in some ways is significant. I think a lot of times we tend to think that violence is one way or the other, that it's directed towards the spouse or the children. Or we tend to think that
Right.
maybe women tend to abuse children more because women are the primary caregivers. But the reality is, and this gets back to the research by the people I just mentioned, Jeff Edelson, the reality is that if a spouse is abusing his or her partner in some way, there's also much more probability that they're abusing the children. And he also found that males who abuse their kids, the abuse is much more severe and much more likely to lead to child fatalities. So this is important, I think, in terms of understanding this case, because people might look at it and say, well, this is child maltreatment or this is filicide, right? And that's not quite true in the sense that I think, again, I want to get back to this frame of this is really about domestic violence, and the children just happen to be collateral damage in many ways. That he's abusing the spouse first and foremost. That's the primary person that he's interested in harming. And then the children, unfortunately, are a part of that equation. That he's a dually aggressive father. So that's an important distinction to make.
Okay.
Now, in terms of how this turns into homicide or how this turns into fimilicide and how we're
Right.
going to answer the question about why he didn't kill his wife, I need to consider some of the research on fimilicide. And there are a couple of main categories of fimilicide offenders. But again, I see this more as a case of interpersonal violence that happens to result in the murder of children. But let's talk about this in terms of fimilicide. This is from a textbook called Domestic Homicide. It's by Liam and Conrad. I've referenced it before. It's probably the best textbook on domestic homicides. They identify two classes of fimilicide. The one is what they call the despondent husband. Usually those are driven by economic issues, economic problems that the males feel in some ways inadequate because they're not providing for the family. And so because they see the future as bleak, they resort to extreme measures, and often they will kill themselves. We've talked about this in terms of Alec Murdaugh, actually, that there was a lot of dire economic circumstances with him because he was embezzling. And so he tends to kind of fit this category of the despondent husband more so than Chad Doerman. Chad Doerman would fall into the category that the authors refer to as spousal revenge. And so I'm going to read a little bit from this text because they summarize it better than I could. In the spousal revenge category, the perpetrators are motivated by anger and revenge following their intimate partner's threat of withdrawal or estrangement. In such cases, as the name spousal revenge suggests, the process of moving through a separation or divorce leaves these perpetrators feeling shaken and alone. These men reach a state of ignominy, where these men experienced an intense shame over their partner's desire to end the relationship. Child victims in these cases can be considered an extension of the intimate partner. From the perpetrator's perspective, he has been betrayed by his intimate partner and by everything that she loves, namely the children. In the fimilicide, he seeks revenge by killing her and all of her children. From this perspective, femilicides resemble intimate partner homicides generally, as the primary object of aggression constitutes the spouse rather than the children. And so I think that is starting to give us an answer as to why he did not kill his wife. Because he sees the children as an extension of her. And he's seeking revenge. He wants to punish her, presumably, and we don't know this for sure, but he wants to punish her, presumably, because she's talking about divorce, or she has talked about divorce, or she's threatened him with divorce.
Right.
Or she's threatened to leave him if he continues drinking. These are all things we've heard, all possibilities, but essentially, you have a domestic violence situation with a Cobra who also happens to be violent towards the children, but he's not particularly, from a Fimilicide standpoint, he's not necessarily interested in in harming the children per se. He wants to harm his wife. He wants revenge.
And that's what many people are saying. He wants her to suffer.
Right. And so the children are seen as an extension of the spouse. And I think that's why he does not kill her. So when you think
wasn't about getting
it,
rid of everyone. This wasn't a murder-suicide, which we see so often.
Right. Not at all. Right. Not at all. I think this really fits into this category of spousal revenge. And it explains why he didn't kill her. He had every opportunity. He was close range with her. He had a rifle. He obviously could have killed her. He didn't. And he didn't kill himself. And I think the reason he doesn't kill himself is because, I know this sounds bad, but he wants to be alive as long as he can to watch her suffer. He wants to inflict pain on her, presumably for the threat of leaving him or for the possibility of leaving him. And he wants to stay alive because he wants to see her suffer when he wants to watch that. He wants to witness that. So there's clearly, as Jacobson and Gottman pointed out about the sadistic quality that we find in Cobras, this is where that sadistic quality becomes really apparent.
You know, he's pleading not guilty. Is it because of it? Like he wants to even prolong the court process? Will he want to prolong the court process too and everything?
Yeah, my guess is he wants to draw this out as long as possible. You know, people have asked questions about his tears. In his second court appearance, he was in tears, and some people thought that showed that he felt badly, that he had some empathy. Some people thought they were crocodile tears. I don't have a simple answer to that. It would be too early to know if this guy's a psychopath, but I think in general, Cobras would tend to lack empathy, that perhaps the tears were for the judge, that they were for show to some degree. But on the other hand, I think I could argue that if the goal was to punish his wife and he's in jail and thinking about it and he realizes that he actually killed his children, that perhaps that recognition set in and maybe he does feel some remorse about that. Maybe he does feel badly, but I don't know. That's an enigma to me. I could go either way on that. I mean, but it's possible.
I feel like these type of manipulators also can put on tears, and I mean everything's for a reason, for a reaction. Am I right to think that? I mean, the tears are about control too. No, I don't know.
If you think, if you see him as, if I'm more or less in the ballpark about this Cobra category of domestic violence offenders, then you'd probably have to go in the direction of someone who really lacks empathy. He sees the children as objects. I mean, the way he killed them would be indicative of someone who doesn't have a lot of concern for his kids, obviously. So yeah, in that sense, I think the tears, they don't seem real in that sense. I think they're somewhat fabricated.
Yeah, somebody's asking, if he can't feel empathy, how can he get pleasure from this? Pleasure and empathy are two separate things.
Yeah.
He can't feel empathy, but he can definitely.
Right. Empathy, it's a different quality than than pleasure. Sadists feel pleasure. They feel pleasure in harming others. It's a different emotion than empathy. Empathy is generally a pro-social emotion. Sadism or sadistic, feeling sadistic is an antisocial emotion for the most part.
Yeah. I like what Shelley just said there too. That's interesting. I wonder if his tears were the perceived injustice of him being punished when he blames her, that she made him do this.
Yeah, that's true. That would definitely be, yeah, that's a good observation. I think his take would be that she's the cause. Right. I don't see him having the capacity to understand why he did this. People keep saying, I saw some talk of, well, has he talked about why? Has he talked about why? He doesn't know why. If he knew why, he wouldn't have done it. So he clearly doesn't understand his motivations. I think there's this misconception that somehow criminals know why they do what they do. They don't know.
That's something you've told us,
Right.
John. Tell us that when you're in front of criminals. Tell us what you always ask.
Oh yeah, right. So one of the things I routinely do towards the end of every evaluation I do, and I always wait to the end because we've talked about so much, and I've given most offenders a chance to reflect on their behaviors. I even give them clues about what I think are potential triggers or motivators. So I always ask every offender, no matter what, I'll ask at the end, so tell me why you think you did this. And 95% of them just go blank. 95% of them just look at me and they're like, I don't know. I have no idea why I did it. So offenders don't know. And the few ones that do offer some opinions, sometimes they do have some insight, but oftentimes they're way off base too. So, and the reason that's true is because these are not people that engage in a lot of self-reflection, and these are people that they don't value self-knowledge, and they don't value learning, and they don't all the things that you want a normal person to who can engage with the world in a normal way, all those qualities that you want to see in those types of people. You're not going to typically see them in the most violent offenders.
Yeah, Kay Louise is saying the officer asked him what's going on. He answered nothing.
Right, exactly. Like, oh,
Nothing to
really?
see
I
here.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, nothing's going on. You've got 3 children that are deceased lying in your front yard, but no biggie, nothing to see here, right? Yeah, exactly. This is a guy who has no clue why he did it. I mean, I think
I
he
was just going
knows
to
he's
ask you.
violent. I think he knows he's violent. And I think he knows that this is, he's in a violent marriage, or he's the aggressor in a violent marriage, that he's controlling his wife in many ways. But in terms of him having him connecting those dots and understanding how that led to these murders, I doubt he has that insight.
Lamisa, I like what you say. He's likely spent his entire life making other people responsible for his emotions and his reactions. Zero self-awareness. I want to ask you, if you sat down with Chad and asked him that question, why did you do it? What do you think he would say?
I would expect him to say I was angry. I would expect him to give me like a really obvious answer. I was really angry at her. She was going to leave me. She was going to leave me alone without my kids or something like that. And I want it, so she deserves this.
In other words, the equivalent of she made me do it.
She made me do it. Right. Yeah. Which, when you think about it, is that's an answer you expect from a 5-year-old.
Well, they are 5-year. I mean, yeah, exactly.
Right. There's a very childish quality to these types of offenders, like this. Going back to what Jacobson and Gottman said about their childhoods and this need for control because they feel helpless, and there's been a fundamental violation of trust in the relationship with their parents. I think in many ways that sense of helplessness never really leaves them unless they work on it, unless they reflect on it and try to deal with the emotions surrounding that. And so that sense of helplessness kind of keeps them stuck developmentally in many ways, I think.
I want to acknowledge all of the survivors in our chat that have been sharing really heart-wrenching stories of surviving domestic violence or getting out, or some people sharing things that imply that they still might be in a bad situation. I'm reading them, and thank you for sharing your stories in chat. And thank you for those asking about the domestic violence hotline. It is in the description of this video, and it's also scrolling this screen. So,
and I think it's important for some of the research I talked about is really critical for understanding the risks of domestic violence relationships. I'm sure any of our viewers that have been in these relationships understand that there's a damage done to the children. But if someone's in a violent relationship and there's no kids yet, and there's some thought of having children down the road, just know that the probability of that person staying violent or becoming violent towards the children is quite high. It's very high. And so the risk doesn't just stop with the violence towards the partner or the spouse. The risk continues on. It continues when they have children. It perpetuates itself. And that's how we get the cycle of violence. That's how we get generations of violence continuing. And ironically, as I said, in these types of, with cobras in particular, the divorce rate is quite low. That spouses in these cases often stick with these offenders. And the reason is because they're so afraid.
right. Rightfully so.
The fear is just, and Jacobson and Gottman talk about this, the fear is just incredible. It's unimaginable that to wake up every day with the possibility that you could be killed or murdered is horrendous. And so, and I'm certainly not blaming Laura at all.
No.
And I don't even know if she threatened to leave. That's still a rumor, so we don't know. But this does look like spousal revenge to me. And that it's consistent with the research. It's consistent with what spousal revenge looks like. It's consistent with the idea that he kept his wife alive to punish her, right? All of that seems to fit.
Many of the survivors are asking if you'd recommend this book that you're talking about for them after they've been in this relationship, or is it more of a, or do you have another?
When men batter women?
Yeah.
It was actually written for a broad audience. So I think it's slightly dated in terms of the research, but it's still a very useful book. And there's a chapter on the myths and realities of domestic violence that I think is really important to read. And I would recommend it. I think it's fairly easy to get now in like used marketplaces for books. So I would definitely still recommend it. Okay. And again, I want to give a shout out to Neil Jacobson, who I never met because he literally died the night before my seminar with him, and where I was supposed to meet him. And I just want to say that, I'm appreciative of the fact that his research, here we are 25 years later, and his research is still relevant and important, and I'm citing it. So thank you, Professor Jacobson.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else you want to say?
I think so. Yeah, let me finish with one additional thought, and maybe this could be helpful.
Well, let me, do you want to conclude with this? Can I just share a few things then before, or is this?
I don't, yeah, no, I don't, I just want to cite some research about potential risk factors so that some of our viewers might know what to look for.
Please. Thank you.
So let me cite some of the bigger risk factors in terms of identifying specifically dually aggressive offenders. So what I mean by that is offenders that are most likely to abuse their kids and to abuse their spouses. Those risk factors are impulsivity, hostility, So they have an unusual amount of hostility. Many of them suffer from depression. They have substance abuse problems. They've had exposure to violence in their families of origin. They engage in relationship conflicts frequently. So if you're in a relationship where there's conflict all the time, like around the clock, that's a massive red flag. They also have some personality disorder symptoms. So they may not necessarily be a personality disorder, but they have symptoms of personality disorders, and especially antisocial personality disorder. So some of the things to look for there would be a lack of empathy, maybe some narcissistic traits like grandiosity, lack of remorse, lack of guilt, all the things that we talk about related to antisocial traits and even psychopathic traits, a lack of emotion, callousness, this notion of being calm. I don't know that that can be measured, but certainly this idea of reducing the heart rate when you're engaged in conflict. I don't, again, I don't, maybe someone can see that, maybe they can't, but if you see that, run.
Thank you. Thank you. And for those trying to escape, there have been a lot of people saying, you don't necessarily have to say you're leaving, because
Right.
that's a scary time. Just
Yeah.
leave, find a shelter.
There's the reason it's important, maybe possibly, to consult with, for example, the domestic violence hotline or local domestic violence shelters, is because they will help you develop a safety plan. And every safety plan for every victim is going to look a little different. There's a common belief among domestic violence advocates that spouses or partners in violent relationships, they know the offenders better than anyone. And they know their idiosyncrasies. And so the safety plan is often tailored to them and to their needs in ways that they might be able to leave a relationship safely based on that knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you. I also have a book that one can buy on Amazon about emotional abuse. It's my own story, but I believe that during the Gabby Petito case, I made the ebook free. If anybody wants to check that out, I'll try to put the link here. Sorry, go ahead, babe. So I'll throw the link in the chat. Escaping Emotional Abuse. People are asking about books.
Okay. Yeah. Specifically on domestic violence.
Yes.
I think a lot of the books that I am familiar with are more academic, so I'd have to think about that for a minute to come up with. I know the book that I've talked about a lot tonight is fortunately it is geared towards a broad audience, and I think it would appeal to a lot of our viewers.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Other than that, those are most of my thoughts for tonight. Again, we don't have a huge amount of information on Chad Doerman. This happened fairly recently, and a lot of the information is not being shared publicly. So that would be my analysis based on what we know and based on the research. But other than that, I think I would, if people want to ask some questions, maybe we can have a little bit of a dialogue.
Yes, there have been questions. Let me see. I did write a few down, but I think you've reached out and answered most of them. Thank you for taking a few questions. So if anybody, has a question, and if I miss a question that you guys feel like I should answer because the chat is going fast, then also call that out for me. Let me see. I don't see everything that comes by. I'm sorry. So anyone have any questions, go ahead and send them. We'll just wait for a bit. Oh, that's interesting. Ohio has the insanity plea. Do you think they'll take it? I can't imagine. he sure seems pretty calm and together.
Right. When I think the body cam footage, sure, he could try to go for that, but I think the body cam footage shows someone who's pretty calm and collected. There doesn't seem to be any psychosis. I guess they could argue that during the commission of the crime that he was in a mental state where he didn't fully understand what he was doing, but I think it's going to be an uphill battle, especially with the prosecutor saying that he appears to have planned this for a while. So the planning element and the body cam footage, I think that's going to make it really difficult for him to make that argument. But that doesn't mean he won't try.
Right. Can we ask Dr. John about Chad's SI and self-harm as a Cobra? Oh, because there was some self-harm in a video, allegedly. Annie for Life shared a video of self-harming. I don't think we've seen that, by the way. That's a video that came out. Did you know that, John?
Was that recent?
Yeah. For anyone that has more information about that, please share.
I haven't seen that, but that would be completely consistent with everything we're talking about, because I think actually in this particular case, there were clearly risks to his wife, Laura, as well. I think this could have gone either way. He could have executed her as well. So I think this was a fluid situation. And I think if there was some self-harming, that would be consistent with someone who, as one of the neighbors said, is a little bit unstable, but who uses violence fairly indiscriminately, even against himself. And that would be consistent with the Cobra.
This is a tough one. But how does the mother divorce her abuser and the father and then gets time with dad and mom? This is not there to prepare other steps to follow to keep dad from having unsupervised visit. That's a tough one. That's hard. I guess, can I say something to that? Like, make police reports when things happen. Right? Like, that's something that's important.
Right. That's true. The more you can document a history of violence or document aggressive behavior towards the children or towards the spouse, the more compelling the case would be regarding custody and visitation.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in these cases, supervised visitation should be mandatory. You would never let a guy like Chad Doerman have unsupervised visits with his kids if there was a divorce.
Yes. Why do you think he didn't do anything to the stepdaughter? And of course, we don't know if he might have wanted to. We don't know. She got away, she was running down the street.
Yeah. So actually, now that you referenced Annie Elise and 10 to Life, let's Annie Elise, a few days ago, Annie Elise speculated that, and I haven't seen that. I haven't seen this information firsthand, but she speculated that the stepdaughter was running towards, we know she was running towards the fire station, but apparently there's some information from one of the officers that somebody heard shots fired at or towards the fire station. And so if that's true, it hasn't been confirmed. Annie Elise was speculating as well, but she said that if that's accurate, then it certainly appears that he did want to kill her, or maybe intended to kill the stepdaughter as well. The stepdaughter's Alexis.
Well, and it would certainly hurt her. If his goal was to hurt her, then that would certainly do that. Yeah.
And it's not clear, since we haven't seen a narrative of events. The indictment has the charges, but we haven't seen, for example, the full report or arrest report or the various versions by the officers or the neighbors. So we don't know if Laura, his wife, witnessed the executions, right? There's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly transpired, but
Right. He pried one child from her arms,
yeah,
but
he pried one child from her arms and then apparently executed him, presumably in front of her.
that was a question somebody asked. Is the way he did this telling in any way? That was a question somebody asked. Is the way that he chose to do this telling of the crime?
Yeah, I mean, it's very telling. It shows a huge amount of rage, and I think it shows this motive of revenge. So again, getting back to the Fimilicide categories, this idea of spousal revenge, which is one of the major conceptual categories for understanding Fimilicide, it certainly seems to speak to that.
Sarah asks, yeah, and someone is mentioning that the firemen pulled her into a station and they locked down, pulled her into the fire station, the little girl. Bless her. Sarah is asking, can and do abusers change their behavior? I'm not sure if she means like, can they change and stop being abusive, or if they just like become one thing and then another. I think because if that's the case, we've seen Chad Doerman cry in court and seen him say nothing to see here after doing something absolutely heinous. But go ahead, John, if you know what she might.
I've done therapy groups with domestic violence abusers for years. And yes, I have seen some of them change. I will say that pit bulls are more amenable to change than cobras, since cobras tend to have more personality disorders and they probably tend to fall more in the category of psychopaths. That some offenders are more amenable to change than others. And certainly offenders that have fewer personality disorder symptoms would be more amenable to change, but they can and do change.
But let's also explain, though, that doesn't mean people should be staying. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, right. That's not an endorsement of staying in a bad relationship or a bad marriage.
Correct. Any other questions? I think we're good. Haven't been too many questions. I think you answered most of them for people tonight. Thank you again to people sharing their stories. Last night, we posted a really interesting interview of Adam Cox, Lori Vallow Daybell's brother, and her uncle Rex. We learned things that we had not yet heard anywhere else. And John did ask about family trauma in that interview. Let's see if I can pull that up and share that. But that was last night, and it's something we recommend. Let's see here. Here it is. So we don't have as many mods today because we told them, like, do not be here if it's too much for you. And I know that there are people choosing not to be here, and then there are people that are choosing to be here because this is such an important conversation. So thank you to our sensitive, respectful audience. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Anything else, Dr. John? Oh, so let me just share. Thank you for all of those that watch this. Next week, are we going to do Coburger next week? I think that's the plan right now. We're still working on that. We have some things to say. And let us know in comments any questions you have about this case, and if you would like to see us continue to follow this, because some people are saying, please continue following it. And others are saying that, they don't know if they want us to continue following this case. So just let us know. And any questions you have in comments. What are the warning signs of verbal and emotional abuse? And when does someone need to leave a relationship? I would say, well, go ahead, John, if you have.
No, did you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I still haven't shared my ebook. I only shared the Amazon link because I'm looking for it, by the way, guys. I'm looking for it on Google and it's not popping up fast. But because the ebook is free. All you have to put is in $0 to get that. But I think that's something I try to tackle in my book. But But I think that there are many signs, and that's what my book goes over, from gaslighting. I don't even know you have to start covering them. So maybe you should probably take this, John. This
Well,
is your profession.
I mentioned some of those signs. Certainly, a lack of empathy is a major one. A lack of empathy is consistent with cluster B personality disorders, which would be narcissism, antisocial personality, borderline personality disorder. So a lack of empathy would be a big one. I think someone who's impulsive and can't restrain their aggression, that would be a major sign. And when I say aggression, I mean verbal and physical aggression. So you can be verbally aggressive. If you're impulsive and you can't restrain that, and somebody lashes out at you repeatedly, that's definitely a warning sign. I think anyone that's overly hostile, and especially hostile if you're female, especially hostile towards females, or makes disparaging remarks about women in general, that's a big warning sign. Someone who has significant mental health problems and displays some of the other things I just mentioned, that would be a problem. So the mental health issues in and of themselves wouldn't pose a problem, but the mental health issues with the lack of empathy and the hostility and the impulsivity, that would present problems. Substance abuse issues coupled with some of the other things, hostility and aggression, that would pose a problem, because substance abuse is going to exacerbate all the other issues. If somebody's hostile and has underlying hostility towards women, for example, and they're drinking a lot, that's going to make it significantly worse. People that have grown up in violent homes, or grown up with a lot of trauma and have impulsivity and hostility and aggression, that would be a problem. Those would be issues. Somebody who has not sustained a long-term relationship at all. And by that, I mean, in terms of assessing risk, usually long-term is defined as 2 years. So if somebody hasn't been in a stable relationship for 2 years or more, that's usually a bit of a red flag. Somebody whose relationships are inundated with conflict, and somebody who blames other people all the time for all their problems, specifically an ex or a spouse or a partner, that's a red flag, because they're clearly not taking responsibility for their part in whatever the relationship issues are. I could probably go on and on. I mentioned some of these, but that's a reiteration of some of the warning signs, I think.
Thank you. Yes. And when you're dating, someone always talking about themselves, somebody, subtle things. There's so many subtle things. Jealousy, that feels good. Jealousy,
Yeah.
that's
Possessiveness.
Possessiveness. That is not flattering at the beginning, even though some of us think it is.
Possessiveness is actually, there's some correlation between possessiveness and later violence. Possessiveness is one of the biggest predictors of not only violence, but the level of violence, the type of violence, the nature of violence.
True story. When John and I started dating, I definitely had been through a lot. By the way, I did share my ebook in the chat, guys. The link, I did find it for those that need a free a copy. And I broke up with John, not because I didn't have like feelings for him, but because I just needed some space. I was anxious, and I think I just needed, I don't know what it was. Things were moving too fast. And John like just stopped calling me, and I was like, what? That's it? That's it? He's not like calling me the next day going, no, please don't. He was just like, okay.
Yep. I stopped calling you, and then actually I can add to that story, like the second night after you broke up with me, you called me. And I was like, why are you calling me exactly? I thought aren't we?
Because you gave me my space. And also I was like, okay, now we can do this.
But it was a little peculiar because, I wasn't I guess we're talking about possessiveness, right? Like I wasn't going to I had no no desire to interfere with your goal, with your decision. So
Yeah, as people are saying, I almost let the best one get away. It's true. No, yeah. Someone's asking, can abusers hide? They absolutely do hide. But these are the subtle signs they show. They can, they hide, and then they're wondering if just they no, as in. So Rachel is asking. I'll just ask it. Do abusers always show signs, or can they hide it and then just one day do something like this? In other words, what Keith said. Oh, something happened. My son just cracked. Is how I take that. Questions.
People are usually going to give you some indication that there's trouble ahead. People are they can hide a lot, but they can't hide everything. So I think if you're aware and paying attention to some of the more subtle elements of the relationship, I think you'll definitely see some of the warning signs.
Yes. Agree. Anyway, I agree with you. Anyway, thank you for taking that call when I called you back. But yeah, no, he did. What I was wanting. I was feeling anxious. I was used to guys being possessive. I was used to feeling suffocated or feeling out of control in relationships because of pushy suitors and someone. And I was anxious, and I broke up with you, and I'm sorry that I did that. And I'm sorry, I'm telling everyone here today too, but 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 the point is, he wasn't he wasn't that way, and he showed me respect, and then made me realize even more that I'd found someone unlike anyone else. So thank you, babe. Thanks for taking me back.
So that would be a warning sign too. If you break up with someone and they don't respect that boundary and they blow your phone up and they pursue you and stalk you, and yeah, definitely run, because if somebody breaks up with you, even temporarily, they should respect that boundary, or there should be a boundary that's respected. And if it's not, that would be a problem. So
yeah. Thanks, babe. And someone else wanted to ask this too. What do you call a woman or a female that does the same things we're talking about? I would say we'd call them an abuser.
Yeah.
I mean,
the gender doesn't matter. It's the same dynamic. It's the same behavior. Yeah. It's not. I mean, the numbers, males in general are more violent and more aggressive. So the numbers would definitely show that men are involved in more domestic violence relationships, but it's also true that women are aggressive and violent, and men can be victims. So it's not always one way.
Yeah. One other relationship story, because I'm on a roll and our anniversary's coming up in 2 more weeks.
Okay.
But
I can't wait to hear this one.
Well, I just think people will think this is funny because, we've nicknamed you Dr. Babe. And the reason you were nicknamed Dr. Babe is because I would call you Babe, and people would say, you got to stop calling him Babe. It's not very professional. He's a doctor. I'm like, but he's Babe. The funny thing is he was the first to, like, I don't know, what do you call, to say sweet things like, I don't know, what did you say? Love or sweetheart. And it was you were concerned that I wasn't, like, I would only call you John. I don't even remember how this came up. And I was like, dude, just give me time. And now here we are 7 years later. And I'm like, Dr. Babe.
See, anything's possible.
Sometimes many of us just need space, right? Everyone, we need space. So,
so another red flag would be someone who doesn't give you the space,
right?
And that encroaches on your space or your boundaries and doesn't listen. So.
Yeah. So it just is funny because I went from refusing to call him any like special name or nickname um, to not being able to stop enough so that now he's even has the nickname Dr. Babe. Anything is possible. So,
well, in fairness, that nickname originated because one of our viewers complained about how unprofessional it was, and of course,
I
once you put that out there, of course, all our gems were like, "Yeah, it's got to be Dr. Babe."
I know. So, but I used to only call you John until
Yeah.
I felt comfortable. So, uh, so in other words, look for a man that's patient, that's understanding. A lot of us have been through a lot, right? So, of course, we're going to have triggers. It's not necessarily our fault. Find someone who's patient. So, thank you. Dr. Babe is adorable. Terms of endearment. That's what I was looking for. I was thinking for the term terms of endearment. You're like, you use terms of endearment and I didn't. And you're like, what's your deal? And I'm like, just give me some time. Just give me some time. I'll end there. The stories are flowing. We'll end there. Don't worry, babe.
Okay. Yeah. Well, since we're wrapping up here, I wanted to end with a quote that I feel like summarizes some of my feelings about not only the situation, but just child victims in general. So I started with a quote from Dostoevsky, kind of talking about why it's so difficult to see children victimized. And I'm going to end with a quote that I think is beautifully written, that expresses, at least for me, some of my outrage about children victims. And so this is from a book called Errata, An Examined Life by George Steiner. George Steiner is now deceased, but he was a well-known American cultural critic. This is page 168. Quote, "When I am confronted via reports, pictures, personal notice of the infliction of wanton pain on children and on animals, a despairing rage floods me. There are those who tear out the eyes of living children, who shoot children in the eyes, who beat animals across their eyes. These facts overwhelm me with desolate loathing. The hatred, the despair they unleash in me are far in excess of my mental and nervous resources. The hot blackness I feel engulfed in transcends my will. I am possessed by enormity." I wanted to read that because I think that also helps understand some of the response to this tragedy, that this despairing rage over what happened and this sense of enormity about some guy executing his kids in daylight in front of his neighbors. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And so I think my response to this crime was very similar to kind of what Steiner's reaction is to harming children in general. And it's just unfathomable, as I said earlier. And there is an enormity to it because even though I've provided some explanatory framework for understanding it, in some ways it's always, this type of crime is always going to transcend or exceed our ability to fully understand it. So, and I think Steiner captures some of that with the quote.
Thank you, babe. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you for this conversation that I think was necessary when it comes to Chad Doerman. I think that that's what is so important about the true crime community, is that it allows for us to have these discussions. And yes, if any of you are in these situations, please find a way out and contact a shelter, as John said, and or call the domestic violence hotline that has been scrolling on our screen or in the description of this video. For those that want additional documents, we have the indictment as well as the dismissed DV charges, and also in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you for your subscribing. Thank you for your likes. Thank you for your membership and kindness. And until next week, we'll see you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.